Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast. This is episode number 98, and the show notes for this one may be found at libertyweekly.net/98. And I've been alluding to a change in the Liberty Weekly podcast coming around November time, but I'm so excited to announce this that there is a co-host joining the show, and I think you will probably find him a little bit familiar. So go ahead, Keith. Take it away.
Patrick, thanks so much for having me, man. I'm very excited to check out the show. I was just watching the Essential Books for Libertarian Novice the other day, and you just made so many great calls on that. That I'm so proud to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, dude. And we've been kind of talking about this for the last couple weeks, but Keith has been kind of a reoccurring guest on the show, and I feel like every time we do episodes, I have a really great time. We hit some really good points. And plus, Keith, you are a rising star in your own right, man. So if you're not aware, which you should be by now, Keith has an awesome YouTube channel, Keith Knights Don't Tread on Anyone, and the link will be in the show notes page for this. But Keith, you have 27 high-profile libertarian interviews under your belt. Why don't you just talk about that a little bit before we get into the topic for today, which is economics in one lesson?
Well, basically, I think it was like 2 years ago, I thought the most important thing to promoting a free society would be explaining how law and order worked, because it's sort of like that's what the state is there for. Without law and order, there would be chaos. And then I came across Ed Stringham's 2 books, Private Governments and Anarchy in the Law, and those books just blew me away. I need to reread them. So I emailed him and asked him for an interview, and it went pretty well, relatively, considering I was so broke at the time. I had terrible Wi-Fi, and I even lose it once, and we had to get back together and make part 2. But that went so well that I just kept asking other people. I got Mance Rayder on twice to discuss both of his meme books, which are terrific. I had Stephan Kinsella to talk about revisionist history. I had James Perloff on to talk about his book, and we just go through all the wars up from like recently in Syria back to the Spanish-American War. I interviewed Larkin Rose for 4 hours, and we go through pretty much every topic, including Stormy Daniels. I talked to Stefan Molyneux twice, but I was on his show as a caller, so it's not really an interview. I interviewed Jeff Tucker, Larry Sharp, Walter Block. I interviewed Mark Passio for 4 hours. That was cool. Anthony Davies, and most recently David Friedman. And then I had James Corbett on and Bob Murphy recently. But yeah, those are some of my favorite ones. If you want to find those, download them, re-upload them under different names. I think they're real valuable. I try to get at the heart of their work, not just talk about what do you think about the MAGA bomber? Something that's going to be dead in 48 hours. So if you could please check those out, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and your interviews are so good that I think they need more access and more listeners, and a lot more people unfortunately listen to the podcast feed, at least in this show, than my YouTube channel. So I think that we'll be airing some of your interviews as episodes of the show proper, but we're still trying to figure out how everything is going to work with. I think that I'm going to be doing solo shows. You might do solo shows. We're going to be doing shows together. So cool. I'm really excited to see how this will develop. But why don't you take us away a little bit on the topic for today, which is economics in one lesson, the first libertarian economics books that everyone should read. This is one of the first books that I read going into the show. So take it away.
So this is probably the best non-Austrian economics book. And I like how he actually gives the lesson in the opening chapter. He basically starts out, while certain public policies would, in the long run, affect everybody, other policies would benefit one group only at the expense of all other groups. This is so important because every time they talk about, we need Bill X to help group Y, you often don't hear politicians talking about the general overall cost or the cost to others. So when they say we need to raise the minimum wage or something, they're only talking about the people who would keep their job if the wages increased. people who are more productive, people who have college degrees who are not going to be necessarily affected. They don't talk about the people who have the least amount of experience or the least amount of skills. So the fact that he just opens up with something like this was written 60 years ago, and politicians still haven't caught on, is actually pretty sad. So it's also a depressing book, as is Paul Krugman's book, The Conscience of a Liberal, by the way, for those of you who want to check out that travesty. He says, the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy or its effects only on a special group, and to neglect to inquire what the long-run effects of are on all groups. This was the housing bubble, obviously. They said the Community Reinvestment Act of 1979, along with Fannie and Freddie, the mortgage-backed securities crisis, it was basically, look, we could get a bunch of people into new homes. How are you against that? What are you for, homelessness? How could you not think this is terrific? And what they don't show you is there's a reason those people couldn't get loans. They couldn't afford the houses. So when all of them couldn't pay back their mortgages, you had the crash as a result of state interference into a private loan trade. So that is another example that we're not getting into, and unfortunately, they still haven't learned that lesson. He ends with saying, in one single sentence, here's the entire book. So you can stop watching after this, but I think you'll enjoy the other chapters. He goes, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists of tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but all groups. So see how that's so different from the economics you get either on CNBC or even in colleges, where they're like, economics is GDP, the stock market, and the unemployment rate. That's not really what it is. That's not really getting at the fundamental basis of that. So like if GDP wasn't calculated from the year 1500 to like 6000 BC, there were never any economic issues. Economics is just this recent thing. I think that's ridiculous. Patrick, thoughts on chapter 1?
Yeah, I have a bunch of Patrick-isms that if you know me in real life, I bring up all the time, constantly when talking about politics or economics. And one of my big isms is, well, first of all, this is the seen versus the unseen. And we were also going to do The Law by Frederick Bastiat. But the biggest thing that I always mention to people, or I try and frame it this way, is that what we always are trying to do is fight the effects of a given policy and not the root cause itself. Take, for example, the drug war. And as I've started my law career and doing public defender work, I see a lot of quote unquote public servants who are good people, and they are just struggling with, they're trying to help in this certain way. They're trying to do all they can, but and I've heard this from people, everything we seem to do, it just seems to get worse and worse. That's because you are fighting the effects of a given policy and not the root cause. So, i.e., if you were not referring to the old antiquated 1920s and 30s policy of prohibition, you wouldn't even have this problem of a black market. You would know, drug addicts would know what they were getting, and so the argument goes. So what we're doing, prohibition, is trying to fight the effects of a given policy. All of the war on drugs is fighting the effects of the policy, which is prohibition, which is causing all these bad fluxes in the market. So let's go on to chapter 2 then.
Yeah, focusing on the branches and of the tree and not the root, you're not going to get at the heart of the problem. So yeah, that's greatly important. This is simply just chapter 2 is just his great analogy of the baker who has a broken window. He then pays money to have it fixed. So what the average economist will see is, look, there was an exchange of $50. Therefore, wealth was created. And thank God we had that, or else wealth would not have been created. What Hazlitt is saying in this is, what you don't see is he would have either saved that money and bought something he desired more, or he would have spent the money on things he would have wanted rather than something that just came up that he needed to fix. So it could have been spent on something he appreciated, something else that he valued, or it could have been saved. The underlying claim is that just because you don't see something happening doesn't mean something isn't happening in the background or something wouldn't happen in its place. Thoughts on chapter 2?
So I was a big fan of Peter Schiff. Well, I still am a big fan of Peter Schiff. And when I first started, because the last time I really read this in depth was when I first started becoming a libertarian and discovering all this. And I was listening to a lot of Peter Schiff, and the big analogy Peter Schiff always makes is everyone says, oh, our infrastructure is crumbling. Well, we're going to have so much economic growth if we just take all this money and divert it towards rebuilding our infrastructure. And it's going to be a great investment. It's going to do all these things. It's going to make all these jobs. We're going to have all these benefits from improving our infrastructure. And Peter Schiff says, no, it would be better if the roof didn't leak or if our roads weren't broken and we didn't have to fix the roads. So that's my thought on chapter 2.
All right, chapter 3. By the way, for the show notes, we got to have Peter Schiff analogies in there. There's a 10-minute video of just Peter Schiff giving analogies. It's like my favorite thing to fall asleep to outside of Dave Matthews, The Very Best Of.
Just angered a whole lot of people.
Chapter 3, The Blessings of Destruction. This prick, Donald Trump, I was at the rally in Arizona the other day to meet people and stuff. In the last week, Trump has said on 60 Minutes to Leslie Stahl, he said, well, you know what, as much as we'd like to not trade with the Saudis after this whole journalist debacle, you know, we sell a lot of arms to them, and that really helps as far as jobs. People like Lockheed Martin and Boeing openly saying there's a military-industrial complex and that these are basically public works projects. He then, in Arizona, said, oh, it was terrific. We were in Tucson the other day. We got to meet with people from Raytheon. I'm like, is he trying to, like, blow the whistle or something? Or is he just not thinking that there's other people in the audience who have read Smedley Butler, who know about Eisenhower's speech? Or maybe he just has no context. But the general claim is that when something bad happens, it's actually good because money is spent to fix it. This is just the broken window fallacy on a bigger scale. It's like saying Katrina was good, Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Harvey was actually a good thing because it stimulated growth. Of course not. People would have spent that money elsewhere. And also, have you no empathy for all the misery that, like, the bombings of, I don't know, Nagasaki caused, or like the Galveston flood of 1900? To look at those and say, wow, I bet some people made money off that. I think that's totally ridiculous, but he makes fun of it almost and saying it confuses need with demand. The more war destroys, the more it impoverishes, the greater is the post-war need. How much better off economically we all are in war than in peace? In other words, if your own country grows from spending, wouldn't you just bomb your own cities? Well, first comes the moral aspect. That's immoral, and that should stop us from doing it to foreigners. I don't think I have anything else on that chapter. Basically, he finishes, but what really takes place is a diversion of demand to these particular products from others. They will have just that much less manpower and productivity capacity left over for everything else. And that is all. Oh, yes, he uses the analogy. If England, instead of being hurt only to the extent she was by her participation in the war, had she had all her great cities destroyed, all her factories destroyed, and almost all her accumulated capital and consumer goods destroyed, so that her people had been reduced to the economic level of the Chinese. In other words, if you take this to its logical conclusion, you go from broken window to mass destruction to the Dark Ages. And then you're really at economic growth, Paul Krugman. Those are my thoughts on that chapter.
Well, I have further quotes too. War destroys accumulated capital. And then at the end, but such complications should not divert us from recognizing the basic truth that the wanton destruction of anything of real value is always a net loss, a misfortune, or a disaster, and whatever the offsetting considerations in a particular instance can never be on net balance a boon or a blessing. And I've been doing the series on the Germanic folk law. And one thing that I've always been trying to hit up is that the hallmark of civilization is that we have found ways to solve conflicts over scarce resources non-violently, because at some point in time, people realized that aggression or might equals right usually equals a net economic loss, at least within your society. We still have, different societies pillaging each other, or different nations or what have you, but at least within the society, they have found a way to make order reign in the sense that we do not resort to violence when we have conflicts over scarce resources. Keith?
Sure. My opening quote for an interview I just did with David Friedman. By the way, I asked him what he thinks is wrong with the Austrian school and what he learned from his father, Milton. And he has such a great answer. You got to check that out. The best quote, I think, in his book is, "The use of force to solve the problem of scarcity is such a terrible solution. It's only often used by small children and large nations." And that's so true. The large nations never bear the cost when the public has to bear the cost. So there's so much brilliance in that one quote. Chapter 4, public works means taxes. All that is necessary is for government to spend enough to make up the deficiency, is the claim that I think he does a great job at refuting when he says all government expenditures must eventually be paid out of the proceeds of taxation. So if you're just looking at the country and you say the country is better off because of spending Project X, I think Peter Schiff gave the analogy. It's like taking money from your right pocket and putting it into your left pocket while burning like 10% of it. You're actually worse off overall. If you have to pay for something forcefully instead of paying for it voluntarily, you're sort of striking at the root of economic wealth. When you trade something, it's because you value what the other person has more than what you have, and vice versa. When money is extracted from you forcefully, you're worse off. So all force, all taxation makes everyone worse off a priori, basically. So I think that covers everything in this chapter. Oh, he does a terrible thing where he justifies government. But I guess that'll be another episode. But that is all I have on that chapter. Any thoughts?
Well, the only thing that I have is that I was chuckling in the beginning of your coverage of this chapter, because that line that you read, I have highlighted in my book. So bromance moment. But
that's funny.
It just reminds me of that the meme with the extension cord that's plugged into itself.
Yeah.
All right, so chapter 5.
Taxes discourage production. They're taking money from A in order to pay for B. B is seen, A is forgotten. I think that sums up chapter 5. And I got to say, he's great at doing that, at really getting the concepts down into short sentences. Any thoughts?
No, I think so. This just reminds me, I lent this book to my Bernieite friend, and he didn't fucking read it.
I don't believe you. A Bernie supporter is ignorant of economics. You're making stuff up. Chapter 6, credit diverts production. The thing I have here is really interesting. He goes, there is, so in other words, when statists will often say, look, we need credit, they'll often just say that and think that credit from government is just like credit from the private sector, except you're voting to get it. That's not it at all. He makes an important distinction. There is a decisive difference between the loan supplied by private lenders and the loan supplied by government agency. usually careful in their investigations to determine the adequacy of the assets, is something that acquires to the private lender, where the public lender, no such cost exists. So in other words, you don't really have an interest when you're swiping someone else's credit card to make good decisions. Government lenders will take risks with other people's money, the taxpayers. The private lenders will not take with their own money. This is him foreseeing the SNL bubble, and the housing bubble, and I guess the internet bubble to a small extent. They overlook the people whom it plans to derive of funds. So it's not like you got John McCain calling everyone, I got to use a different senator. I don't even know the senators in Arizona now that McCain's dead. Not that it matters. But you don't really get a vote on this stuff, whereas the board of directors and businesses often get a vote. No such thing exists with regard to the state. So credit diverts production is simply the state taking money from productive avenues and giving it to less productive, less desired avenues. That's all I got.
It just makes me think of the when the Austrian school says, "Hey, the federal funds rate or the interest rates actually do play a role in the economy," whereas Keynesians think that they can manipulate it at will. But at some time, what the interest rate really is a signal as to the available resources in the economy. So.
Sure. Excellent book for that. On the show notes could be Economic Depressions, Their Causes and Cure by Murray Rothbard, Meltdown by Tom Woods, and How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes by Peter Schiff. That one is so good because it's basically a comic book. And it's so fun. You can just read it in a hammock.
I'm going to read that to my kids.
Yeah. Have like one of the stethoscopes, so while they're in the womb, you can read it to them and they can listen.
Life goal.
It's funny. He actually mentions at the end of that chapter the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and that's where the bubble ended up coming from. Chapter 7: The Curse of Machinery. I feel like this is something I run in today all the time. Machines on net balance create unemployment is the fallacy. He refers to The Wealth of Nations, talking about the division of labor. He cites the book History of the Machine Wrought Manufacturers from 1867 and mentions the cotton spinning machinery in about 1960. Really took a lot of jobs away from slaves. However, it didn't make us worse off. It made us better off. He then says in part 2 of this chapter, he quotes Eleanor Roosevelt in 1945 saying, "We have reached a point today where labor-saving devices are good only when they do not throw the worker out of his job." Had this evil bitch been in charge, we would have still had typewriters and we'd still be using, I don't know, carrier pigeons. How many people had phones back then? He says, not only should we have to regard all further technological progress as a calamity, we should have to regard all past technological progress with equal horror. So we have to be consistent. We can't say, all right, everything that I currently have and am comfortable with is good. Everything that will exist and is potentially a threat to me is inherently immoral and should forcefully be stopped from producing by the state. Machines may be said to have given birth to its increased population. For without the machines, the world would not have been able to support it. The real result of the machine is to increase production, to raise the standard of living, to increase economic welfare. The other day at work, our software went down, and I think we did 1/10 of the orders we otherwise are able to do. So we served 10% of our customer basis, making us that much less productive. So imagine if our wages were that low that we could only produce that much. thanks to machinery. Patrick, any thoughts?
You just read the quote that I was going to read. I had it highlighted. However, our mutual friend, James Corbett, whom we both interviewed, he had, what was it, the how or why big oil conquered the world. And one thing that he always talks about is this fear mongering over the population time bomb, and how the useless cannon fodder of the world, which is the overpopulation according to the powers that shouldn't be, how they're going to cause everyone to die. But yet, as the population grows, we keep coming up with ways to produce food and produce an overabundance of food in many situations. And that's what automation hath wrought. So that's one thing that I never really worry about, is overpopulation.
Oh yeah, it's amazing how things like someone like Thomas Malthus can be refuted and people still have the fear. So they basically just dress it up differently. You can see that in James Corbett's video, Meet Paul Ehrlich. And he just goes through, Paul Ehrlich is the modern day Thomas Malthus, and he just refutes his entire body of work. It's terrific. Chapter 8, Spread the Work Schemes. Basically, this is a less efficient way of creating something than otherwise would be created. Allied to this fallacy is the belief that there is just a fixed amount of work to be done in the world. He refers to the federal wage hour law. The first effect of this is a reduction in the standard working week from 40 hours to 30 without any change in the hourly rate of pay. He then finishes by saying there is no limit to the amount of work to be done as long as any human need or wish that work could fill remains unsatisfied. Did you have that one as well?
Yep.
Any final thoughts on that one?
That's about it. I mean, aside, I could go off on a tangent about post-scarcity and how that's not possible at all. But I think we got it.
Give us a little taste of your post-scarcity ideas, because I think that is what's driving a lot of the universal basic income, is that people, because what I think universal basic income would happen is you'd issue the universal basic income. First of all, it's inherently immoral. It takes money by force when force is inherently immoral. But you'd have people who would not work as hard. That would then lead to a reduction in productivity, a reduction in consumer availability to products, which would sort of increase the poverty rate and decrease wealth creation. And then they could blame capitalism and then justify another state intervention. So I feel like that is just such an obvious ploy. Do you think post-scarcity is something that can exist, like what we do with PDFs? We can just copy and paste them ad infinitum. Could we not do that with computers themselves?
Well, fundamentally, unless we are somehow able to become immortal, time itself will always be a scarce resource. And that is the point that Hans Hermann Hoppe makes in A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, which is how I've always been a John Locke type, and this is going off on another tangent. Previously to a couple months ago, over this summer, I was always a John Locke, natural rights, pure Lockean natural rights, homesteading, what have you, as being the justification for why we have natural rights. Well, I got into Hoppe's A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, and the reason why we need property rights and why we have property rights and why they are just is because scarcity will always exist, because we only have one life and one body. We can only experience time in a linear fashion. There's no going backwards, at least, physics aside, whatever, that's not my field. But the reason why we need property rights is to solve conflicts over scarce resources, and scarcity will always happen. And property rights is the most efficient and moral way to solve those conflicts over scarce resources. So that's, in a nutshell, you'll always have scarcity because we only have one body and time goes linear and you can't go backwards.
Yeah, he mentions in the beginning of Theory and Socialism and Capitalism, with my body, I want to smoke a cigarette, you want to have an affair with it. I want I want to do X with a certain thing. You want to do Y. And I was actually just reading Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. Chapter 7 is the most important chapter, I think, of any book ever written, until Dave Matthews' biography comes out. I'm kidding. Okay.
Do you have a fucking bookshelf behind your computer or something, or do you just have all these within arm's reach?
You know what? I had 3 books on me, and that was one of them, to be totally honest.
We're such nerds.
Chapter 9, disbanding troops and bureaucrats. This again refers to Trump's comments about Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin being job creations as sort of like an argument for let's stop building weaponry. Or let's continue building weaponry, rather. He says, after every great war, there's great fear there will not be enough jobs for these forces. If they come home, the result will be unemployment. The fears of unemployment arise because people look only at one side of the process. It would be like saying, we need government to keep Blockbuster open, or else all Blockbuster employees will be unemployed from here to eternity. No, people get different jobs. You can research different things, get different skills. That's all part of an economy. That's all part of you playing your job in creating demand for other people. He goes on to say, I love how he just takes it to its logical conclusion. He goes, it could just as well apply to a racketeer or a thief who robs you. After he takes your money, he has more purchasing power. He supports it with bars, restaurants, nightclubs, tailors, perhaps automobile workers. Shouldn't we allow theft as a morally legitimate way to run society because it sort of spurs spending? It'll help certain industries. No, what we see automatically, first of all, it's immoral. Second of all, it diverts resources, money, away from ways they'd be spent in which people actually demanded products or services. Any thoughts on that one?
No, I think you got it, man.
Here is chapter 10, The Fetish of Full Employment, which has my favorite line in the entire book. The progress of civilization has meant the reduction of employment, not an increase. So that alone right there. We're not striving for total employment. We're striving for total wealth or total consumer satisfaction. It is because we have become increasingly wealthy as a nation that we have been able to virtually eliminate child labor. Of course, capitalism is blamed from child labor, even though children had been working from the Adam and Eve days up until the Industrial Revolution. They only pin it on the Industrial Revolution, obviously, to say, without the virtuous state, children would be at risk as they're murdering children by the thousands, whether it be in Yemen or Waco. Any thoughts on chapter 10?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
Chapter 11, Who is Protected by Tariffs? Because this is such an important topic with Trump today, Patrick, what is your general response, morally and economically, to government implementing tariffs?
Well, I think it's one of the biggest reasons why, and I think that Dave Smith talked about, I don't know if it was Dave Smith or someone else who just talked about it on his show, but it's another reason why these third world countries remain third world countries. And it's why people in the United States, in the lower class, as it were, cannot have as many cheap goods. And it's just a lose-lose. My boss is a big Buy American type. And he claims to be a libertarian, but we haven't really had the conversation much anymore. But every time he mentions, because I have, dang it, I have this really cool coffee thermos that I got from Walmart, and it keeps things hot for way longer than the Yeti thermoses. And I was like, it's a Contigo. Yeah. And so we got into a fight over the Contigo versus the Yeti. And I didn't really elaborate because I don't want to be vindictive because I just kind of started. But yeah, my Contigo is better. It's cheaper. It lasts longer. But he bought his Yeti because it was made in America. And he paid more.
Well, was it made in his state, or did he ship jobs off to a different state?
Right.
Or was it made in his city, or did he ship jobs to a different city or county or town or street or house? This is just nonsense once you apply it consistently.
That's a great point.
And then morally, this is one that I've gotten from statists. Probably one of the best statist objections is it voluntary for me to purchase this book by Henry Hazlitt? Yes. So, therefore, paying sales tax is voluntary because it's just part of paying for the book. It's sort of like a fee. No, it is a third party violently interfering in a peaceful interaction that they have no right to do so. So it's not like a fee. It's me saying, every time you yawn or buy a shirt, you have to send me $5 or else I'll cage you. If it's one of my shirts, I can put whatever strings I want on this. So that's an important statist fallacy. I got that comment on a video I made, The Ultimate Red Pill. That was probably the best statist response to everything that was on there, which is saying something. Chapter 11, who's protected by tariffs, he goes on to say, never to attempt to make at home what will cost him more to make than to buy. In other words, if you do apply the logic consistently, everyone should make everything by himself, not just his nation or his state or his city or his street. You should just do everything, or else you're you're giving someone else a job you can have. Don't you just want jobs? This goes to show you how politicians will have the wrong end in mind. Because people like jobs or education, they'll say, I'm running on a pro-jobs, pro-healthcare, pro-education plan. The ends are not necessarily achievable just because you're claiming to desire them. So jobs are simply a means to get wealth. The fact that they don't focus on wealth creation, Thomas Sowell often says, is pretty much a good case that the left is engaging in a totally fraudulent ideology, as well as the right. But we only have so much time to hate people. American employment on net balance has not gone down, but American and British production on net balance has gone up. So if trade is sort of like a win-lose thing, and America and Britain trade with each other, over time, we'd see one group becoming poorer and one group becoming richer. That's not what we see at all. Therefore, a case for free trade is economically justified, along with being morally justified. From the consumer's point of view, if he can buy something cheaper, he has more money to purchase other things, making him on net wealthier, while the Federal Reserve is devaluing his currency. But it's one peaceful way to make yourself wealthier. It's also what Milton Friedman referred to as the best check against monopolies that the statist is so terrified might exist in the absence of a state. Any final thoughts on tariffs, free trade, or monopoly?
Yeah, it's just this thought that everything is a zero-sum game that you get from Bernieites a lot. And I believe Dave Smith always brings up this really great point, is that people in America, let's say we have an excess of money and we pay, I don't know, on net $100,000. $1,000 per household to get some miracle cancer cure. Well, would you really say that we were less off because we were paying this money and we had a deficit? We would say we could only get the cancer cure from India. So we paid them, more money than we were getting back in terms of selling our goods. Will we really be less off because we had the cure for cancer, but yet we were in the negative when it comes to a trade balance? So I think that's a great point that Dave Smith always makes.
And this is the problem with looking at collectivist wealth rather than individual wealth. You can say in all of America, you can always point to a person or group who was not necessarily losing, but not directly benefiting from a certain policy. So they then use that as the poster child for their whole economic theory. Instead, if you just look at individuals, as he mentions in the Drive for Exports, the next chapter, if it was just exporting that you should care about, then you'd have no need for imports. And imports are the whole reason. It is what we would call a consumer purchasing an item domestically. So the fact that people think that there's so much of a difference between an individual acquiring wealth and a country acquiring wealth shows that the country is economically illiterate. Any final thoughts on that one?
Nope.
All right. Saving the X industry. Government not only shouldn't save industries because it's immoral to fund something coercively, it also is super inefficient. I tweeted a great article titled, "Will MySpace Ever Lose Its Monopoly?" And I think it was from 2005 or something, or maybe 2009. But it was just so funny because you constantly see this. You see articles, "Will Sears ever lose its monopoly?" A good way of seeing whether or not things should be broken up or companies are so big they'll just last in perpetuity is to look at a history of the companies in the Fortune 500 or the Dow Jones Industrial Average, 30 companies or the 500 companies, and you constantly see companies going in and out of there. That is a self-correcting mechanism that consumers, producers, and workers have between each other. Government, on the other hand, whenever they do something inefficient, they get more money, whether they print more or tax more or just borrow more. I think that covers all of the fundamentals of that book. We talked about minimum wage prior. Do unions really raise wages? And I mentioned how wages are basically determined by labor productivity, giving the example of when the software at my work went down. Union wages raise at the expense of other workers is a point that he makes. However, if you want to unionize, I definitely see it as a benefit for workers who probably have less economic power than the average boss. I think it's important that they organize for collective good or to exchange information. I don't see anything wrong with that. But there is another side to it. It's not just like we need unions. Unions equal inherently good. So I think it's great that he provides a different way of looking at all these other things. Any final thoughts on Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt?
Well, just your touch on unions that you just had. Mance Raider had Thaddeus Russell on his show. And I'm making more work for myself in the show notes page, but I should link to that episode there. There was a great discussion of the renegade history of the United States where Thaddeus Russell talks about the 40-hour work week and how that came about and how weekends being off became standard and stuff such as that. So an interesting little discussion, especially how ANCAPs are wrong sometimes, Thaddeus Russell points out, as he is wont to do in many situations. Other than that, no, this is a fundamental book. Let me brighten your day a little bit and say that my copy of the book came, I don't know if you can read it, but this, oh, it's backwards. It came with this little note on it, and it said, 10-page report, read entire book, first outline and report. So someone had assigned this book in a class, and the previous owner had used it. So there's a little positivity for you.
That's terrific. Oh, I really hope so.
You know, that reminds me of, I had a book with Lysander Spooner's works in it, and I checked it out from the library. It was this one, and it was Bruce L. Benson's The Enterprise of Law. And I checked it out from my law school library at Mitchell Hamlin. And turns out the Lysander Spooner book was edited by Murray Rothbard. It was from the 70s or 80s. And the Bruce L. Benson book, well, was Bruce L. Benson. But I looked in the checkout thing, and I was the first person to check out the book since like 1980 something or 19. And so Tom Woods is right when he says that when you go to these universities, it's great to be a libertarian because all the books that you want are always in the library. So I had it checked out for like 8 months. I kept renewing it because I worked at the library and I would just renew it.
Was it called the Lysander Spooner Reader?
It might have been. It's in one of my videos because I talked about it and I held it up.
Well, that just gives us more material for the future. Patrick, look forward to working with you. Again, he ends the book by reinstating the lesson. Economics, as we now see again and again, is a science of regarding secondary consequences. That's just a different way of saying what he says initially. Thank you for having me on, man. I look forward to doing future episodes.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun, Keith, and I'm really looking forward to it, too. Just a few brief notes here as we're closing up. You always know how to support the Liberty Weekly podcast. That is at patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. Here you can see it on the screen. We have a few great patrons, Morgan and Lee and Devin, who have new patrons and have decided to up their pledge level as well. Go on to libertyweekly.net/Amazon and do your regular Amazon shopping. We will get a cut that we will use to buy more books and do more shows just like this one. So really appreciate your support. Also, I have been doing every episode now sends out an email alert. So if you want to sign up for our email list, just go to libertyweekly.net/email or navigate to libertyweekly.net and find the email button in the horizontal menu bar at the top of the website screen. So thank you so much, and we'll be back at you with more content. Peace.